The heyday of the horror comic was the 1950s, when the EC Company terrorized America with titles like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. However, EC was throttled by the rigid censorship imposed with the introduction of the Comics Code. Now, one title has reversed this tide. DC Comics' Swamp Thing hits the stands each month without the code's filtering influence, and its author has become the most famous and admired comic book writer since Marvel Comics' Stan Lee. Both with the power of his visual imagination and the unparalleled flexibility and articulacy of his prose, he has redefined what is possible and what is permissible in a field once regarded as strictly for children. Horror is an undercurrent in all his work, from the political superhero fable Watchmen to the future war SF of Halo Jones. Surprisingly, he is neither from Nebraska nor New Jersey, but from Northampton. His name is Alan Moore.
Horror is a very potent social tool. I mean, people tend to have sensibilities that have been jaded by the constant exposure to the media, the news headlines, the sort of stuff on television. People tend to build up a sort of an armour around themselves almost, where they don't really have to experience anything terribly closely. Now, horror is such an excellent cutting tool because it can just slice through all of that sort of accumulated dross and sort of sense of deadened emotions, if you like, and actually shock the reader. And having opened them up, having tenderised them with the shock, is able to get across a very powerful message. I mean, I think the other reason why sort of horror is an excellent vehicle in the 1980s is because social conditions have brought the real world much closer to the world that me and other horror writers have been writing about for years. I mean, if you look at, say, things like, something like Alan Bleasdale's Boys from the Black Stuff, Yoss's story, which on one level is a very realistic piece of sort of drama about Liverpool. But on the other hand, I mean, with a very slight change of emphasis, it could easily have been written by Ramsey Campbell, for example. I mean, the idea of somebody going quietly mad in Liverpool with the social security sort of safety nets being wrenched out from underneath them one by one. I mean, that is very much Ramsey Campbell territory.
Whereas there was a kind of horror fiction for a while that would use the contemporary setting as a contrast. It would be the supernatural taking place against a background that was instantly recognisable and banal and everyday and so forth. In my stories, it's much more likely to be an expression of that environment in some way. I can't pretend that this is wholly original. Fritz Leiber was writing stories about Chicago in the 40s, which were probably the greatest single influence on what I write of that kind of story. On the other hand, maybe I've done it in a different way.
What attracted you to horror in the first place?
That it frightened me. Has to be that. Which was to say it did the same thing to me at the age of 7 or 8 as Victorian goblin stories had done to me at the age of 5 or 6. What I also assume it must have done was to present terrors which were in some way controllable. I could read about them and they would go away, though it's only fair to say they went away maybe after a while, maybe after a week of sleepless nights. I mean, when you ask me that question, in a sense, I actually don't know. I mean, my entire childhood was spent in such a kind of state of panic anyway, that it astonishes me that I could read stories which did it to me all over again in a different way. I can only assume that the real appeal of them was that they spoke to something larger than themselves. They actually carried a sense of awesomeness as well as a sense of simple terror, and that's presumably what I was looking for, something bigger than myself that I could latch onto.
One incident from my childhood that I can remember very clearly was just having a terror of injury to the eye. And I remember once getting a needle and picking it up and I was about 6 or 7, and just holding it so that the point was just touching my eyelid, and then taking it down and shuddering for about the next 3 weeks. I don't know why I did it was probably completely aberrant behaviour, but it was just, this was the thing that I was most frightened of, and I just had to see what it felt like to know. And yeah, I mean, it made me wince thinking back, I mean, all these years, I think if only I'd slipped or something like that, you know, but that's horror. It's bringing you up to the brink in some way, in a controlled way. But it's making you look at the things that you would otherwise never dream of looking at, the things that you tend to shy away from. And it's a healthy thing, I believe, you know, to actually put yourself through this process, to actually come to terms with what you're scared of, because then it's somehow not quite so big.
Did working in an abattoir in your late teens make an impression on you?
It may have made a slight impression. It wasn't actually an abattoir. We got on the stage after the abattoir. It was still pretty messy. We had a sort of sheepskins with various bodily parts hanging off, you know. And I mean, at the age of 17, I mean, you're quite impressionable, you know. And to be sort of placed in this sort of environment, it does give you a certain appreciation of the more grim sides of reality, shall we say. You know, then I moved on from that to toilet cleaner, and from toilet cleaner to sort of comic book writer. It's been a sort of a steady downhill progression, really, you know. But, yeah, I mean, just living in Northampton. I mean, Northampton's by no means the worst town of its place in the country or the world, but at the same time, we do tend to get an awful lot of very strange crimes in Northampton. It is a very violent town, considering its size. In fact, I was living for a good time. I mean, one of the local papers had the idea of drawing a circle with a compass upon a map of the town that happened to include most of the recent murders. And as it happened, if the point of that compass would have been resting upon my writing desk, so if they'd ever triangulated it, I'd have been in deep trouble, you know. But yeah, I mean, Northampton is a place where there is a lot of, behind the lace curtains, there's a lot of madness going on. There's a lot of very evil, nasty, twisted, perverse crime. And it's a good working environment for a horror writer. I mean, it certainly beats the hell out of California. I think that probably if I was sitting by the pool all day, then I might lose some of my edge. But in Northampton, in this sort of dog excrement-littered wasteland, you know, where sort of violent psychopaths lurk upon every corner, it's a perfect ambience, really, you know.
Northampton, I'm deeply sorry. Please write to him, not us. That's all we have for you until our review of 1986, which will come to you mid-afternoon on New Year's Day. Tonight we leave you